The birthday candle had burned down to almost nothing. Elliot Sawyer noticed that first, before the woman, before the cake, before any of it registered as something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. One small flame guttering in the dark, casting shadows across marble countertops that probably cost more than 6 months of his salary. The penthouse kitchen smelled like sugar frosting, and something sadder underneath it. Something he recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years but still know every word to. He had pushed open the wrong door. That was all. The maintenance closet was supposed to be on the left, the building manager had said. Left, he was almost certain, but the layout on the 38th floor didn't match the laminated diagram in his back pocket, and now he was standing in the entrance to Nora Calloway's private kitchen at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, toolbox in hand, completely still. She was sitting on the floor. Not collapsed, not fallen, sitting deliberately the way someone sits when they have chosen the floor because every chair in the room feels wrong. Her back rested against the kitchen island, silk pajamas pooled around her arms, locked around her knees. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm of someone trying very hard not to make sound. On the counter above her head, a single-layer chocolate cake sat on a white pedestal. Pink frosting letters spelled out 3 words across the top. Happy birthday, Ava. Elliot's toolbox hit the floor. The clatter of metal against tile shattered something sacred in the room, and Nora Calloway's head jerked up. Mascara had tracked down both sides of her face in long, thin lines, and her eyes dark and startled and raw, in a way he had never seen in the 11 months he'd worked in this building, locked onto his, with an expression that moved through shock and humiliation and something close to fury before landing somewhere beyond all of those. Somewhere exhausted. She didn't scream, she didn't reach for the phone on the counter or order him out. She just looked at him across the kitchen floor. This powerful woman who ended careers with a single glance and had reportedly made a venture capital firm partner cry in a board meeting last spring, and the words that came out of her were barely above a breath. Please. A pause. Forget this. Have you ever walked through the wrong door and found something that changed everything you thought you knew about a person? Stay with us for the next 90 minutes because this is the story of 2 people broken by loss. One little girl who could see through every wall, and the moment a wrong turn became the only right one. Elliot couldn't move. His eyes had gone to her left wrist. He hadn't meant to look, it was just where his gaze landed, where a small bracelet caught the candlelight. Beads. Plastic pink and yellow, the kind sold at craft stores in bags of 100. Sized for a child's wrist. It sat against her skin with the worn softness of something touched constantly, unconsciously the way people touch scars. He picked up his toolbox. He said he was sorry. He said the building manager had told him the kitchen on this floor, and she held up one hand, cutting him off before he could finish, and pointed to a door on the far wall without looking at him again. Her fingers had stopped trembling by then, or she had forced them to. He fixed the pipe. It took 40 minutes. A corroded elbow joint under the secondary sink. Nothing complicated, the kind of repair he could do with his eyes closed after 15 years in the trade. But his hands moved slower than usual, and he kept his back carefully turned, and the silence from the other side of the wall pressed against his eardrums the whole time. When he finished, he wrote up the work order in handwriting, neater than his normal scrawl, left it on the counter, and let himself out through the service entrance. The elevator down felt longer than it should have. He drove home through streets that Chicago had mostly surrendered to the hour, a garbage truck on Michigan Avenue, a taxi idling outside a hotel traffic light cycling through their colors for no one. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, which was not how he usually drove, and he kept not thinking about the way the candlelight had caught the frosting letters on that cake. Happy birthday, Ava. Lily was asleep when he got home. He checked on her the way he always did, standing in the doorway of her room, one hand on the frame, giving his eyes time to adjust until he could see the rise and fall of her breathing. She had kicked off her blanket again. She always kicked off her blanket. He crossed the room and pulled it back up over her, and she stirred slightly, her small fist tightening around the stuffed elephant she'd carried everywhere since she was 2, and then she settled again without waking. He stood there longer than he needed to. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter and didn't drink it. The drawing was still on the table where Lily had left it, the rainbow she'd finally gotten right after 45 minutes of frustration and one complete restart, the colors blending at the edges the way real rainbows do, the kind of small accomplishment that mattered enormously when you were 7. He had told her before leaving that imperfections could be beautiful too, that the slightly smudged line where the yellow met the orange was his favorite part. She had considered this with the gravity she brought to all important matters, and decided he was probably right. He thought about a pink and yellow bracelet in the dark. He thought about Wren, which he hadn't let himself do in a while, not the last months, not the hospital part, but earlier. Wren at the kitchen table going through mail with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. Wren laughing at something on television with the unself-conscious laugh she only had when she forgot he was watching. He had caught himself setting the table for 3 people twice last week. It had been 4 years. The body apparently kept its own records indifferent to the calendar. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. The next morning arrived the way Chicago mornings arrived in October gray, and certain the sky the color of old concrete, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself until you were already outside and committed. Elliot was at the building by 7, changed into his uniform in the locker room on the sub-basement level, and had 2 work orders completed before most of the executive staff had finished their first coffee. He had spent the commute telling himself it meant nothing. A wrong door, a private moment witnessed by accident. He had seen nothing he needed to think about further, and he intended to think about it no further, and that was a decision he had made firmly and intended to keep. He was replacing a section of baseboard along the 3rd-floor corridor when he felt it the particular quality of attention in a space changing the way a room's atmosphere adjusts when someone enters who commands it by habit. He looked up before he understood why he was looking up, and through the glass wall that separated the corridor from the main executive floor he saw Nora Calloway walking with the precise, unhurried stride of someone who had never once been late to anything in her professional life. She was 30 feet away. The glass was between them. She was carrying a tablet and speaking to someone beside her, and everything about her, the charcoal blazer, the pulled-back hair, the set of her jaw, was exactly what you would expect of a woman who ran a company worth $400 million before her 34th birthday. There was no trace. None. Whatever he had seen at 11:47 the previous night had been folded away with a precision that must have taken practice, the kind of practiced concealment you got only from years of needing it. Then she turned her head and their eyes met through the glass. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe less. Her expression didn't change, not exactly, but something microscopic shifted in her face, a fractional tightening around the eyes, and her hand moved to her left wrist in a gesture so quick and automatic she almost certainly didn't know she'd made it. Then she looked away and kept walking her conversation with the person beside her, uninterrupted, her stride unbroken. Elliot went back to the baseboard. He thought about it through his next 3 work orders. The encounter with Preston Hale happened at 2:15 that afternoon in the sub-basement maintenance corridor where Elliot was sorting hardware into the correct bins, a tedious task he'd been putting off for 2 weeks that suddenly seemed like an excellent reason to be somewhere quiet and unhurried. Preston Hale was the kind of man who wore his authority like a coat he'd bought specifically to be seen in. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with the careful grooming of someone who had decided early that presentation was a form of power and had committed to that decision fully. His suits were never quite as expensive as they appeared, and his smile arrived slightly before his eyes caught up to it. Elliot had repaired a jammed lock on his office door 6 months ago and formed an opinion he had kept to himself. Preston came into the maintenance corridor without announcement and stood looking at the shelving system with the mild assessing curiosity of a man who had never touched a hardware bin in his life. "How did things go upstairs last night?" His voice was conversational, easy, the kind of easy that was constructed. Elliot set down the box of anchor bolts he was holding and looked at Preston directly. Corroded pipe joint under the secondary sink, replaced the elbow, no further issues. Preston nodded, still looking at the shelving. "Long call to get up there at that hour. Building manager said it was urgent." "Right." A pause. "Miss Calloway didn't give you any trouble?" The question was too casual. The casualness was the tell a man with no particular interest in the answer didn't shape the question that carefully. Elliot picked up the anchor bolts again. Everything was straightforward. Preston looked at him then directly, and the smile was precisely calibrated to suggest shared understanding between reasonable men. "Good. Good to hear." He let another moment pass, turning the weight of his attention into something that functioned like pressure without technically being pressure. Then he nodded once more and walked back down the corridor and out through the door, his footsteps even and unhurried. Elliot stood with a box of anchor bolts and a feeling he couldn't immediately name. He sorted hardware for another 20 minutes before it came to him. Preston Hale had not come down to the sub-basement maintenance corridor to make small talk. The building had 312 employees and its own facilities management team, and there was no operational reason for the vice president of the board of directors to be in this corridor at 2:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. He had come to find out something specific. Elliot put the hardware box on the shelf and filed this away in the part of his mind where he kept things that didn't fit yet. That evening, Lily was in the back seat of his truck for the ride home, telling him about a disagreement at school involving a board game and what she described as a serious misunderstanding about the rules, the details of which she laid out with the methodical precision of a prosecuting attorney. Elliot listened and responded at the appropriate moments and drove with the particular divided attention of single parents everywhere present, enough anchored by the sound of her voice the way sailors were once anchored by stars. She had been 6 when Wren died, old enough to understand that her mother was gone, too young to understand the shape of the hole that left in the world. There were things Lily said sometimes that stopped Elliot mid-breath, observations she made with the unguarded honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned to protect people from her perceptions. She had told him once, sitting at the breakfast table over cereal, that she talked to her mother sometimes when she was on the playground and nobody was around. She'd said it the same way she would have said she preferred grape jelly to strawberry. He had managed to say something calm in response, and then had excused himself to the back porch for 3 minutes before coming back. That night after dinner, while Lily worked on a drawing at the kitchen table with the focused intensity she brought to all her art, Elliot stood at the sink doing dishes and thought about Nora Calloway on her kitchen floor. He thought about the photograph he'd noticed half-turned on the wall, a little girl 4 years old, maybe caught mid-laugh in some outdoor place, her arms spread wide. He thought about the 5 years implied in the body language of a woman who had learned to carry something that heavy without letting it show during business hours. Grief didn't operate on schedules. He knew that specifically and without abstraction from the inside. It found its moments without asking. 3 in the afternoon on a random Thursday, the cereal aisle of the grocery store, 11:47 at night on a floor that probably cost more per square foot than his entire apartment. "Daddy," Lily looked up from her drawing. "Do you know the sad lady?" He turned off the faucet. "What sad lady?" "At your building. I saw her today when I was waiting." She returned to her drawing, adding a careful line. She was looking at the little kids through the window, the ones in the aftercare room. She looked really sad. He dried his hands on the dish towel. "I don't know her very well." Lily considered this in her particular way, head slightly tilted. "Her eyes look like yours do when you're trying not to cry, but you think I can't tell." She said this without accusation, without sentiment, as a simple factual observation. Then she went back to her drawing. Elliot stood with his dish towel in his hands and said nothing for a moment. "What are you drawing?" She held it up. A rainbow better than yesterday's, the colors more confidently blended, the arc wider and more generous. At the bottom she had written something in her careful first-grade printing, the letters uneven but legible. "You are not alone." "Can you give it to her?" Lily asked. "The sad lady? Maybe it will help." He looked at the drawing. He thought about saying no, about explaining why this was not how things worked in professional environments, about appropriate boundaries. He thought about what Wren used to say, that small kindnesses could save lives, even when you couldn't see how, that the gesture mattered independently of the outcome. "I'll see what I can do, Bug." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to adding details to the sky above her rainbow. The next morning, Elliot rode the elevator to the 38th floor with a manila envelope in his left hand and a conversation he'd rehearsed in his head 3 different ways and then discarded entirely. The executive floor was already populated by 8:15 assistants at desks, the particular choreography of a professional morning assembling itself with practiced efficiency. Dorothea Marsh had worked as Nora Calloway's executive assistant for 4 years, a fact that had apparently shaped her into someone with the bearing of a person who guards something valuable. She was 51, efficient, and looked at Elliot the way she looked at most things that arrived unannounced on this floor, with the patient measuring expression of someone deciding whether this required her attention or her dismissal. He told her the envelope was personal. He told her Nora would want it. Dorothea took it with the neutral expression of someone who had heard many people make that claim about many things. "I'll see that she gets it," she said, and turned back to her screen. He had work orders on floors 14, 19, and 22 that morning, and he moved through them with the mechanical competence of someone who had done this job long enough that his hands didn't require his full attention. At 11:40, his supervisor called him into the small office adjacent to the facility's locker room and slid a work order across the desk with the particular expression of someone who didn't understand what he was looking at, but understood it was unusual. "Penthouse again. She asked for you specifically." Elliot looked at the work order. The description field said, "Minor repair needed." He took the elevator up. The penthouse in daylight was a different place. Autumn sun came through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long, angled columns, and the white walls caught and distributed the light until the whole space had a quality of something illuminated from within. Without the night shadows, the minimalism that had read as cold now read as deliberate. The home of a person who had learned that accumulation hurt, that objects carried associations, and had made a considered choice to keep the surfaces clear. Nora was standing at the main window with her back to the room when he entered, still in her work clothes, her jacket draped over a chair. She didn't turn immediately. "There's nothing broken," she said quietly. Elliot stopped in the middle of the room and waited. She turned. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them held the particular quality of someone who had spent time recently not crying only through active effort. She was holding Lily's drawing still in the manila envelope, but open now, the rainbow visible above the edge, the crayon colors bright and earnest against the white paper. "Your daughter drew this." Not a question. "She wanted you to have it. She said you looked sad." Nora looked down at the drawing for a long moment. Her thumb traced the bottom edge of the paper where Lily's uneven letters spelled out their simple claim. Something moved across her face, a ripple in the controlled surface quickly steadied. "Children see things adults train themselves to miss," she said. "They haven't learned yet that looking away is polite." She moved to the kitchen counter and set the drawing down carefully like it was something that could break. Then she reached into the pocket of her blazer and removed a photograph, small, worn at the corners, with the particular softness of something handled daily, the image slightly faded from years of light and touch. She held it out. He crossed the kitchen and took it. The little girl in the photo was 4 years old, maybe just turning 5, caught in the middle of laughing at something outside the frame. Dark curls and 2 lopsided pigtails, a yellow dress. She was holding a pinwheel with rainbow-colored blades caught mid-spin, the colors blurring at the edges. Her eyes were her mother's dark deep, the kind that held the whole room when they were open. "Ava," Nora said. Just the name. Then, after a breath, she believed rainbows were magic bridges, that they connected people who were sad on one side to people who were happy on the other, and if you could find the right spot to stand under one, you could cross over. A pause. She had theories about most things. Elliot handed the photograph back carefully, the way you handle something irreplaceable. "What happened?" The question was direct. He was aware it might be wrong to ask it. He asked it anyway because she was holding the photograph in both hands, and her jaw had a particular set that he recognized as the posture of someone deciding whether they were allowed to speak something out loud, and he thought that being asked directly might be the permission she needed. She sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, not the polished, upright posture of a boardroom, just a person sitting down because standing required more than she currently had. "Car accident, 5 years ago. We were going to her ballet recital. She had been nervous about it for 2 weeks. The recital was the whole universe that morning." A long pause. "A truck came through the intersection. The driver ran a red light. I walked away from it." The sentence ended there without completion because it didn't need completion. Elliot sat down across from her without being invited because the moment was asking something of him and he was capable of giving it. "My ex-husband said I was checking my phone when it happened. Work email. He said if I had been paying attention I might have braked differently. Swerved. Done something." Her voice didn't break. It had the flat quality of something said so many times in the interior of one's own mind that the emotional charge had been worn down to the shape of the words alone. "I don't know if he was right. I've thought about it every day for 5 years, and I still don't know." "And so you built all of this?" Elliot didn't gesture, but he didn't need to. The company, the reputation, the 60-hour weeks, and the empty penthouse and the armor worn so consistently it had become indistinguishable from skin. He recognized the architecture of it because he'd built his own version lower to the ground, but structurally similar. Work as answer. competence as proof of something, survival as motion rather than presence. Nora looked at him across the kitchen table. You said you had a daughter. 7, Lily. And her mother. 4 years ago. He kept his voice even. Her name was Wren. She was 32. He paused. Lily was 3. She doesn't remember her the way I do, which is both the harder thing and the easier thing depending on the day. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, does it get easier? The question came out without the careful construction of her other sentences, direct and unguarded, the voice of someone who had been waiting to ask someone who actually knew. Not easier in the way people meant it socially, not the comfortable answer, but the true one. He recognized the weight of it because he had asked it himself once to a grief counselor who had said something useful and something useless in the same session, and he had held on to the useful part for 4 years. Not easier, he said. Different. The grief doesn't get smaller. You grow around it. And some days you find a moment where you can breathe without it being the first thing you notice, where you're just breathing, just present, and the weight lifts for a minute. And those minutes get slightly longer over time. He paused. That's the honest version. She looked at him for a long time. The CEO mask had not come back. He wasn't sure when it had left exactly, somewhere during the photograph maybe, or the name. It had simply stopped being present, and what was in its place was not weakness and not vulnerability in the way the word usually meant, but something more like accuracy. A person at their actual dimensions without the additions. I haven't said her name out loud in almost 3 years, Nora said. Ava. She said it again quietly, like testing whether the word would shatter something. My brother keeps asking me to talk about her, to see someone, to do anything except what I've been doing. And every time I try, it feels like if I stop hurting, it means she didn't matter enough. Elliot's throat tightened with the particular pressure of recognition. He had worn that logic himself, had held it up against Wren's absence like a proof of her importance, her realness, the weight she had carried in his life. He had held on to the ache the way you hold on to the last letter someone sent you, not because the letter is the person, but because releasing it feels like releasing them. She mattered enough whether or not you hurt, he said. That's not how it works. She existed before the accident, and she'll have mattered after you stop crying about her, and she'll have mattered the first morning you wake up and notice that the sun is doing something interesting with the light, and your first thought isn't about her at all, and you feel guilty about that. And then you realize the guilt itself is proof she mattered. It doesn't require the pain to sustain it. Nora was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Not gratitude exactly, not relief. Something more like the look of someone who has been holding a door shut with their full weight for a long time and has just been told they're allowed to step back. His phone buzzed on the counter where he'd set it. A text from Lily's after-school program followed immediately by a photograph, Lily sitting on a bench with a gap-toothed smile that was working hard to look brave. Her knees scraped her rainbow drawing clutched in both hands like a document of importance. Nora had seen the screen. Her eyes went to the photograph and stayed there. She fell, Elliot said. She's okay, just scared. Nora looked at the photo for a long moment. Something passed through her expression, not one thing, several things moving in rapid sequence the way weather moves across open water. Her hand found her wrist, twisting the bracelet once slowly. How old did you say she was? 7, just turned 7 in September. She set the photograph down. She should know. Nora said, her voice lower now, that the rainbow she drew, the one she sent up here, it was the first thing in a long time that made me feel like someone could actually see me. She stopped. Then, that probably sounds strange coming from a stranger. No, Elliot said, it doesn't. He stood to go. He had stayed longer than a work order for a non-existent repair could justify, longer than any version of professional propriety would cover, and he was aware of all of that and found he couldn't bring himself to apologize for it. Some conversations earned their length. At the door he stopped, turned back. Nora was still sitting at the kitchen table, the drawing visible on the counter behind her, the photograph of Ava placed carefully beside it. She'd want to meet you, he said. Lily. She asks about the drawings she sends out into the world, whether they land where they're supposed to. Something moved through Nora's face. Uncertainty first, then something more tentative than uncertainty, the expression of someone who had forgotten how to want things and was relearning the motion of it, one careful attempt at a time. Saturday, she said. "I could order pizza." He thought about saying he'd have to check. He thought about the various reasons this was complicated, the categories it crossed, the ways it could go wrong. He thought about a 7-year-old sitting at a kitchen table writing, "You are not alone," on the bottom of a crayon rainbow at 9 o'clock at night, with the absolute conviction of a person who has never yet learned to be cynical about kindness. "Saturday works," he said. He took the elevator down. Through the lobby windows, the Chicago afternoon was doing something complicated with the clouds, the light shifting in long horizontal bands across the pavement outside. He pushed through this front door, and the cold hit him directly, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to his truck, breathing the particular air of a city in October feeling. And this was the part he couldn't have explained to anyone sensibly, like he had just stepped through a door he hadn't known was there. Not the wrong door this time, just a door. If you're watching from somewhere and you've ever had a moment like that, a moment where you walked into something you weren't supposed to see, and it changed everything, drop a comment and let us know where you're from. We'll keep going. Saturday arrived the way important days sometimes do, unremarkably the morning indistinguishable from any other until you were already inside it. Elliot made pancakes because Lily had requested them with the gravity of someone placing a formal order, and she sat at the kitchen table in her purple dress watching him with the focused attention of a quality inspector. She had decided on the purple dress at 6:45 in the morning, which meant she had been awake before 6:45, thinking about it, which told him everything he needed to know about how seriously she was taking the afternoon. He had tried once to calibrate her expectations. He'd told her that Nora was busy and important, that they wouldn't stay long, that she probably had a lot on her mind, and they should be considerate of that. Lily had listened to all of this with her serious face, the one she wore when she was processing rather than agreeing, and then asked, "Is she the sad queen from the story? The one who lives in the tower and forgot how to smile?" He had knelt to her eye level on the kitchen floor and tucked a curl behind her ear. "Something like that bug." Lily had nodded with the satisfied certainty of someone whose hypothesis had just been confirmed. "Then we'll help her remember." He hadn't argued with that. He'd learned early that arguing with Lily's instincts on emotional matters was a losing proposition. She had spent Friday evening making a second drawing larger than the first, more ambitious, the rainbow spanning the full width of the construction paper, with all 7 colors given equal real estate. At the bottom, with the concentration of someone transmitting something important, she had drawn 3 figures, one tall with dark hair, one medium with no particular features, specified one small with wild curls. All 3 standing under the ark. All 3 with their hands connected. She'd labeled none of them. She seemed to feel the image was self-explanatory. The drive to the building took 20 minutes. Lily sat in the back with her drawing folder pressed against her chest and asked questions about Nora with the methodical thoroughness of someone preparing for an important meeting, which was apparently exactly what she was doing. What did Nora like to eat? Did she have a dog? Was she funny, or more the serious kind? Elliot answered what he could and said he didn't know for the rest, and Lily treated the gaps in his knowledge as simply more territory to be explored in person. The elevator to the penthouse required the guest access card Nora had arranged through building security. Elliot used it, and the elevator rose, and beside him, Lily stood with her drawing folder pressed against her chest and her sparkly shoes pointing slightly inward the way they did when she was trying to hold still. The door opened before he knocked. Nora was wearing jeans and a soft charcoal sweater, her hair down, not the pulled-back severity of the office, but loose, falling past her shoulders, making her look younger and somehow more present in her own face. She had opened the door and was looking at them both, and she was visibly nervous in a way that surprised him, the careful composure he'd come to associate with her replaced by something more unguarded. Her hands moved briefly to the hem of her sweater and then stopped. Lily looked up at her and spoke first the way Lily always did, with no preamble and no warm-up period. "I'm Lily and I'm 7, and I made you another rainbow because Daddy said you liked the first one. And is that bracelet from someone special because it looks really old and important? And are you actually a queen, or is that just a story?" Something happened to Nora's face. It moved through surprise and landed somewhere that looked unmistakably like delight. A real laugh, the kind that arrived before she could decide whether to allow it bright and unguarded and entirely her own. She crouched down to Lily's level with a naturalness that Elliot hadn't expected, meeting his daughter's eyes directly. "I'm not a queen," she said, "but I love your dress. Purple is a serious color. Lily considered this assessment and found it satisfactory. I know, she said, and walked inside like she'd been there before. The pizza arrived 40 minutes later, and by then Lily had established several important facts. Nora preferred pepperoni, had never owned a dog, but had thought about it, knew how to say hello in 5 languages, and had at some point in her childhood broken a window with a baseball she had thrown poorly. Each revelation was received by Lily with the same focused attention she gave to things she was filing for later use. Nora answered her questions with increasing ease, the nervous quality of the first few minutes receding as Lily's complete lack of social agenda made itself felt. There was no performance required. Lily was simply gathering information. It was during the pizza that Lily asked the question Elliot had been watching the approach of like weather on a flat horizon. She set down her slice, wiped her hands with the seriousness of someone who understood this was not a casual moment, and looked at Nora directly. "Do you have any kids?" The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when a question lands in a place that matters. Elliot opened his mouth. Nora's hand came up slightly, not a dismissal, more like a request for space, and he closed it. She set down her own pizza with care. She looked at Lily with an expression that was both open and steady, the face of someone who had decided in real time to tell the truth. "I did," she said. "I had a daughter named Ava. She would have been 9 years old now." Lily processed this with the direct practicality she brought to large facts. "Did she go to heaven with my mom?" Nora's voice held for a moment before it came out. "Yes, I think she did." "That's good," Lily said with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting a conclusion they had reached through sound reasoning. "My mom needs friends. Daddy says she was always the kind of person who needed people around her, or she got restless." A pause, her head tilting. "Do you get lonely?" The question sat in the room. Nora looked across the table at Elliot, and in that look he saw the exact moment she stopped calculating the cost of honesty and just paid it. "Yes," she said, "I get very lonely." Lily slid off her chair without ceremony, walked around the table, and climbed into Nora's lap with the complete confidence of someone who has assessed a situation and determined that a hug is the correct and obvious response. She wrapped both arms around Nora's neck and held on with the particular ferocity that small children have, the kind that means it. "You don't have to be lonely anymore. Me and Daddy are good at keeping people company." Nora's arms came up slowly, the way someone moves when they've forgotten the motion and are relearning it from the inside. She held Lily with both hands, and her face went into those dark curls, and her eyes closed, and the tears that had been held behind everything for the last hour, maybe for the last 5 years, came quietly with no performance and no sound, just the body finally doing the thing it had been built to do and been kept from doing for too long. Elliot's throat was too full to speak for a moment. He managed, "She's right, we're pretty good at it." They stayed for 3 hours. Lily spread her entire drawing portfolio across the living room floor and conducted what amounted to a guided exhibition, explaining the significance of each piece with the authority of an artist who expects to be taken seriously. Nora sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, not on the couch, on the floor without being asked, and asked questions about color choices and compositional decisions that Lily answered with equal seriousness. At some point, Elliot found himself on the couch watching the two of them with a feeling he hadn't felt in long enough that it took him a moment to locate the name for it. Warmth. The uncomplicated kind without the aftertaste of loss that usually qualified everything. When they finally left, Lily was already planning the next visit. She announced this in the elevator on the way down, not as a request but as a statement of forthcoming events. He said, Sunday Park's the duck pond, she could come if she wanted. He said it to the middle distance between himself and the elevator wall, not quite to the floor they'd just left, leaving the offer in the air where it could be taken or not, without cost to anyone. His phone buzzed before they reached the lobby. A text from Nora, sent in the time it had taken the elevator to descend 38 floors. Sunday works. Sunday worked, and then the following Sunday, and the one after that. The park became a weekly fixture with the gradual inevitability of things that fit the duck pond and the swing set and the particular slant of autumn light through the trees that lined the north path. Lily ran ahead, and they walked behind, and they talked the way people talk when they've stopped trying to make an impression and are just saying what's actually there. Nora told him about Ava's conviction that ducks understood English but chose not to respond out of principle. Elliot told her about Wren's complete inability to follow a recipe, the absolute creative confidence she brought to cooking instructions that produced results ranging from accidentally inspired to technically inedible. They laughed at the specific things, and then they went quiet with the specific things, and both kinds of silence were comfortable in the way that silences only become when you stop needing to fill them. 3 Sundays and standing at the pond while Lily threw bread and negotiated loudly with the ducks about fair distribution, Nora said something that stayed with him past the day. I used to think that talking about her meant I was moving on, like the conversation itself was a form of surrender. She was watching Lily rather than him. But it turns out talking about her is the only way she stays real. The silence was making her smaller. He understood this not as an idea, but as a physical thing, something he'd felt in his own chest over 4 years of both talking and not talking about Wren. The people who stayed real were the ones you kept saying out loud. At work, things had begun to shift in ways he noticed but didn't comment on. Nora remembered the names of people she had passed in corridors for years without registering. She stopped in the elevator to ask Dorothea's opinion on something that wasn't strictly business. Once passing the Employee Wellness Center on the 14th floor, she paused at the window long enough that the woman walking behind her nearly collided with her, looking at a bulletin board advertising grief support resources with the expression of someone finally ready to read something they'd been walking past for a long time. The board evaluation period was running, 30 days ticking. Preston had been quiet in the way that felt strategic rather than absent. Have you ever watched someone you care about slowly come back to themselves one small moment at a time? Drop a comment and tell us. We read every single one. Elliot found the letter on a Thursday evening in October, 3 weeks after the first Saturday pizza. He had been putting off clearing the last storage boxes from the hall closet boxes from the apartment before this one, packed the week after Wren died and moved twice without being opened, carrying the particular weight of things deferred. He'd told himself he'd get to them when he was ready. He had apparently needed 4 years to reach ready. Most of it was the ordinary accumulation of a shared Lifebooks kitchen. Things a set of picture frames they'd never gotten around to hanging. Then at the bottom of the second-to-last box he found the toolbox. It was small, a personal one, not a work set, the kind used for hanging pictures and assembling flat-pack furniture and the minor domestic repairs that were Wren's self-assigned domain, because she had strong opinions about things being level. He had looked for it after she died and hadn't found it, assumed it had been lost in the move, and then stopped looking because looking for things belonging to people who were gone had a way of undoing him. He set it on the kitchen floor and opened it. The tools were Wren's, her specific selection, her organizational preferences, her handwriting on a strip of masking tape inside the lid, cataloging the contents in the meticulous way she cataloged everything. And beneath the top tray, folded twice and placed flat, was an envelope, his name on the front in her handwriting. Not sealed the flap, just tucked the way you'd leave something you meant to give to someone soon. He sat on the kitchen floor for a while before he opened it. The letter was 3 pages written on the yellow legal pad paper she'd always used for anything important. The date at the top was 8 months before she died, 9 months before the diagnosis had been confirmed as what they'd feared. She had written it during the period of waiting, the scans and the appointments, and the particular suspended quality of time during which they had both known something was coming, and neither had named it fully. She had written about Lily, about how he should tell her she was allowed to feel angry, that anger was part of love and didn't negate it. She had written about practical things, the kind of careful considerations that were an act of love from a person who understood that love sometimes expressed itself as logistics. And near the end, in the same practical handwriting, she had written, "If you ever stop hurting enough to love again, do it. Don't wait the way I waited to tell you things I should have said sooner. Don't make someone else wait for you to decide they're worth the risk. You are not the grief, Elliot. You are also the person who was happy before it, and you'll be that person after. Lily needs to see you whole. So do you." He sat on the kitchen floor with the letter in his hands for a long time after he finished reading it. He told Nora about the letter on a Wednesday evening 2 weeks later, Lily asleep on the couch under a throw blanket after exhausting herself with the drawing portfolio review she'd insisted on conducting. The city's lights spread across the penthouse windows in the particular way they spread on cold, clear nights, like someone had scattered a jar of salt across black glass. He hadn't planned to tell her. He'd planned to keep it in the private category of things that were his alone. But she had just finished telling him about the first therapy appointment she'd made. her voice carrying the careful forward momentum of someone who has started something they know will be difficult, and the honesty of it made something in him open a corresponding door. He told her about the boxes, about finding the toolbox, about sitting on the kitchen floor. He told her what the letter said without reading it word for word, carrying the substance of it rather than the transcript. He watched her face as he spoke and saw recognition moving through her expression. Not the polite recognition of someone relating to an abstract concept, but the immediate, specific recognition of someone hearing their own interior architecture described in someone else's words. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Nora said when he finished. "She was ordinary in all the best ways." He meant this precisely. She wasn't larger than life. She was exactly life-sized, which is rarer. Nora was quiet for a moment. The city moved outside the windows, indifferent and continuous. Ava's father, after the accident, after everything, he built a new life in under 2 years. New city, new relationship, new child on the way, by the time our divorce was final. She said this without bitterness, which was more complicated than bitterness would have been. I used to think that meant he'd loved her less. Now I think maybe he was just less afraid. What are you afraid of? She looked at him directly, and the directness itself was its own kind of answer, the willingness to hold his gaze while saying something true. That if I want something again, anything, anyone, it will be taken. That the cost of wanting is losing. That I've already learned exactly how bad that feels, and choosing to be vulnerable again is just choosing to be in range of it. Grief had taught him that particular fear from the inside too, the way loving someone installed a specific vulnerability that nothing else installed, the way you handed someone a blueprint of everything that could hurt you just by letting them matter. The alternative is that you're safe and alone and nothing can touch you, he said. And I've tried that version. It's not as safe as it sounds, and it's much lonelier than it looks. Something shifted in her expression, a settling like weight redistributing after a long time held unevenly. She didn't respond immediately, and he didn't press. Some things needed the space after them. Outside the windows, Chicago moved through its ordinary late-night rhythms, traffic thinning, lights cycling the lake, invisible in the dark, but present in the particular quality of the air. Lily made a small sound in her sleep on the couch, and they both turned to look at her. And the moment held something neither of them tried to name. The newspaper article appeared on a Friday morning. Elliot saw it during his commute, a financial news aggregator he checked occasionally for building-related company news. The headline was Surgical Callaway Ventures, CEO's Mental Stability Under Question. Sources close to executive floor speak out. The article was 3 paragraphs of strategic insinuation. Nothing provable, everything damaging. It referenced unspecified sources, mentioned the 30-day board evaluation, cited concerns about leadership capacity and language that sounded clinical until you parsed the specific word choices and understood they had been chosen for maximum implication. One phrase stopped him cold, a passing reference to maintenance staff with unusual access to penthouse. Not an accusation, not technically, but present enough that anyone reading carefully would register it. It was a specific cruelty, the kind that understood how to cut without leaving a visible mark. He sat with his phone in his hands on the train and thought about Preston Hale in the sub-basement corridor, asking questions in a voice calibrated to sound like nothing. He thought about the second time Preston had approached him 2 weeks ago, the offer framed as concern, as helpfulness, as something that would ultimately be good for Nora. Information in exchange for security. Elliot had given him nothing. He had said nothing to anyone. He was aware that being blameless and being implicated were 2 different things, and that the article had been written by someone who understood the difference and had decided it was irrelevant. The board meeting was 3 days away. He didn't see Nora that day. He saw her the next morning, Friday, and the way she saw him told him everything. She came around the corner of the executive corridor, and their eyes met, and hers held for a fraction of a second, a question that was also an accusation, just enough to register before the professional mask reconstructed itself over it. She kept walking. She didn't slow. But her hand had gone to the bracelet on her wrist and stayed there, pressing against it with a deliberateness that was different from the unconscious habit he'd come to recognize. By 4:15 he had a notice from building management, a transfer order effective immediately reassigning Elliot Sawyer from general building maintenance to sub-basement infrastructure, signed by Preston Hale, who did not technically have HR authority over the facilities department, but apparently had enough influence with the building management company to make that distinction irrelevant in practice. He stood in the sub-basement locker room with the notice in his hand and thought about what Wren would say. She would say he should find out what actually happened before deciding what to do about it. She had a foundational commitment to evidence that had made her a good accountant and an occasionally exhausting person to have an argument with. He thought about Lily, who had colored 3 new drawings for Nora in the past 2 weeks, and asked every morning whether they had talked. He thought about Nora on the kitchen floor of her own penthouse, sitting with a birthday cake and a child's bracelet, and 5 years of silence that had been slowly doing to her what prolonged submersion does to a person's lungs. The sub-basement was quiet around him. Pipes overhead, fluorescent light, one fixture slightly dimmer than the others, a repair he'd logged and not yet gotten to. He folded the transfer notice, put it in his pocket, and started to think clearly about what he actually knew versus what he'd been positioned to appear to know. He spent the weekend mapping it not on paper but in his head, the way he traced complex building systems following each connection until the structure of the whole became visible. Preston had known about the penthouse visit the morning after it happened. Preston had offered him a financial arrangement contingent on information about Nora's state of mind. Preston had signed the transfer order. The article had appeared 4 days after Elliot refused the arrangement and had included a specific reference to maintenance staff access that served no journalistic purpose except to generate a particular implication. The shape of it was clear. The evidence for it was not yet sufficient. On Sunday at the park, Lily ran ahead to the pond and Nora walked beside him, and neither of them said the thing that was between them. She had not apologized. He had not explained himself. The question she had asked with her eyes in the corridor was still open, unresolved. A splinter neither of them was pressing directly. He understood that she had been here before, had built her entire interior architecture around the premise that trust was a structural vulnerability, and that one newspaper article positioning him as the source was exactly the kind of evidence her defenses had been designed to treat as conclusive. Lily came running back from the pond and grabbed both their hands simultaneously, pulling forward. "Come look. There's a duck with a weird feather on its head. It looks like a hat. You have to see it right now. It might leave." They let themselves be pulled, and for a few minutes, in the particular grace of a child who didn't know yet that the adults beside her were carrying something unresolved. All 3 of them stood at the edge of the duck pond in the October cold and looked at a duck with a feather that did objectively resemble a small hat. And Lily's running commentary on the duck's distinguished bearing made Nora laugh 3 separate times the real laugh, the unguarded one that she could no longer fully suppress even when she was trying to. Elliot watched her laugh and thought, "She thinks I betrayed her, and she came to the park anyway. She came to the park and she's laughing anyway." That told him something about what she wanted to believe, even if she couldn't get there yet. It told him the case was still open. He would just have to find the evidence. Monday he went back to work in the sub-basement. He fixed the fluorescent fixture. He started quietly, carefully making a different kind of repair. The building's internal communication system logged access requests and interdepartment messages with timestamps, a compliance feature installed 3 years prior after a liability issue unrelated to anyone currently employed. Elliot had worked on the server room ventilation twice and understood the system's architecture well enough to know that logs were retained for 18 months and accessible to facilities staff for maintenance coordination purposes. He was facilities staff. He had a legitimate login. He began reading. 4 evenings. Working after his shift in the sub-basement office, the fluorescent overhead throwing clean light after the fixture replacement he'd done on Monday. He was looking for the shape of a pattern, the way he looked for the source of a structural failure. Not the symptom presenting at the surface, but the origin point, the place where the integrity had first been compromised. He found Dorothea first. A series of messages from Preston's administrative account to hers spanning 6 weeks' requests framed as board-level coordination asking for Nora's schedule under cover of preparing evaluation materials. Dorothea had complied because the requests had arrived through proper channels with correct authority signals attached, because she did her job correctly, and because Preston had constructed the requests to be indistinguishable from legitimate board function unless you already knew what you were looking for. Her conduct was procedurally clean. She had been used without knowing it. He found the deleted files on the 4th evening. The deletion had been performed through a standard administrative function, but the server retained ghost records of deleted content for 90 days, a legal discovery artifact. The ghost record showed the file name, deletion timestamp, and enough metadata to confirm the content category. Elliot submitted a facilities maintenance ticket citing a server room audit requirement, which gave him legitimate access to the recovery partition, and pulled the file. A meeting record. Internal dated 5 years and 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks after the accident that killed Ava. A calendar entry for a meeting between Preston Hale and Garrett Cole, formatted as routine board consultation, the kind that appeared on schedules regularly enough to be invisible. But attached to the calendar entry, preserved because it had been embedded rather than linked, was a document, 11 pages. A summary of what Garrett Cole had provided to Preston at that meeting, medical consultation, records a first responder statement from the accident scene, and Garrett's own written account describing Nora's behavior in the car in the minutes before the collision. Distracted, checking her phone, work email, not paying full attention. Below Garrett's account, in Preston's handwriting on a scanned addendum, were 4 lines: leverage sufficient. Timeline 18 months to destabilize leadership confidence. Board majority achievable by year 3. Acquisition at reduced valuation. Elliot sat in the sub-basement office with this document on the screen and felt a quality of cold anger that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The accident had killed a 4-year-old girl. Within 2 weeks of her burial, 2 men had sat in a room and entered her death into a spreadsheet. He printed 3 copies, put 2 in separate envelopes, locked the third in his toolbox. The board meeting was the following morning at 9. He had not told Nora what he'd found. He had considered it for 2 days and decided against it. Telling her in advance would give her time to try to protect him from the consequences of what he was about to do, and he didn't want to be protected from those consequences. More than that, she needed to be at full capacity for the board. Receiving this information privately without structure around it might break her open before she could walk into that room, and walking into that room was exactly what she needed to do. He arrived at the 38th floor at 8:40. Dorothea looked up from her desk, and he saw in her face a complicated arrangement. Guilt, apprehension, something that looked like it had been building for a week and was ready to resolve in whatever direction presented itself. He told her he needed to go into the boardroom. He had materials relevant to the evaluation. She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she found in his face was sufficient. She reached into her drawer and handed him a guest lanyard without a word. Preston was already inside, talking with 2 board members near the window. He saw Elliot approach through the glass wall, and his posture made a small, involuntary adjustment, the recalibration of someone spotting an unexpected variable that their planning had not accounted for. Nora arrived at 8:55 from her office at the far end of the floor. Full professional assembly blazer hair backed the complete structure of the person who ran this company, intact and load-bearing. She saw Elliot standing outside the boardroom door with a folder in his hand and stopped walking. Her face moved through several things in rapid sequence before settling on something carefully neutral. Her fingers found the bracelet the way they always did when the ground shifted beneath her, not reaching for it, just arriving there, the body's oldest reflex. He held her gaze without looking away. He was asking for something, a small extension of trust from a reserve he knew had reason to be depleted, and he watched her make the decision in real time, watched the competing calculations resolve into something that was not quite faith, but was adjacent to it. She looked at the folder, then at him. Then she walked to the boardroom door and held it open. "Mr. Sawyer has materials relevant to the evaluation," she said to the room in the voice that closed arguments before they started. "We'll hear them." Preston's expression completed its recalibration into something that looked for just a moment like genuine apprehension. He was not a public speaker. What he had was 3 printed copies of an 11-page document, 15 years of explaining complex problems clearly to people who needed to understand them quickly, and the specific composure of someone who has already decided to do something regardless of outcome, and has therefore been released from the anxiety of deciding. He put a copy in front of Preston. He put a copy in the center of the table. He kept one in his hand. He explained what the document was. He explained how he had found it and under what access authority, step by step, nothing omitted. He explained the timeline, the meeting 2 weeks after Ava's accident, the leverage assessment in Preston's own handwriting, the 18-month destabilization strategy, the acquisition plan at reduced valuation. He was factual and sequential the way he explained infrastructure failures to building managers who needed to understand what had gone wrong and why origin point propagation path, current state of damage. He explained Dorothea's role, that she had been used instrumentally without knowledge of the purpose, and that her conduct had been procedurally correct throughout. He said this clearly because it was accurate and because she had handed him a lanyard that morning without being asked, and he owed her the honest version on the record. He explained the newspaper article and the transfer order. He explained the 2 approaches Preston had made to him in the sub-basement corridor. The questions framed as small talk, the offer framed as concern for Nora's well-being, the specific terms proposed. Then he set the folder on the table. "I'm a building maintenance technician. I don't have authority in this room and I'm not claiming any. I'm here because someone entered a 4-year-old girl's death into a business plan and then spent 5 years waiting for the damage to compound." He paused, and the boardroom was very quiet around the pause. "And the person who has been running this company successfully for 6 years has spent that same time holding herself responsible for an accident that was by every account except one man's self-interested version not her fault. That seemed like information this board should have before it voted on anything." He picked up his copy of the document and walked out. The door closed behind him with the soft pressurized sound of a room that was about to become very loud. He was in the sub-basement an hour and 50 minutes later, replacing a section of deteriorated pipe insulation, when he heard footsteps on the metal stairs. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of building management coming to discuss the morning's events, and not the even pace of someone on routine business. These footsteps had a different quality, the sound of someone who has been through something that rearranged the interior landscape and is still finding their footing on the new terrain. He knew it was Nora before she came through the door. She stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Her blazer was gone. She looked like exactly what she was, a person who had just sat in a room and watched the full architecture of a 5-year betrayal presented in 11 pages of documented evidence, and had remained in her chair throughout, and had voted with the board when the vote was called, and had walked out of the room still standing. She crossed to his workbench and placed something on it, Lily's second rainbow drawing the one with 3 figures and their hands connected. He stared at it for a moment before understanding registered. She had brought it with her to the board meeting that morning. She had carried it into that room. He had not known that, and knowing it now did something to the inside of his chest that he didn't try to name or contain. "Preston has been suspended pending investigation," she said. "The board voted unanimously to dismiss the evaluation proceeding. Garrett will be contacted by legal." The formal accounting ran out and she stopped, and what remained on her face when the professional structure fell away was something he had only seen once before, that night in the penthouse kitchen, the first night when he had pushed open the wrong door. Raw and accurate and entirely unmanaged. "I'm sorry I doubted you." "You were protecting yourself," he said, and meant it without qualification or resentment. "I understand that better than most people." "You walked into a room full of people who could end your career in this building," she said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone working to say something precisely rather than approximately. "To defend someone who spent a week believing the worst of you." He looked at her directly. "You came to the park that Sunday. While you were still deciding what to believe, while the question was still open, you showed up anyway." He paused. "That told me something about what you actually wanted to be true. I wasn't going to let that part of you down." The last of the carefully constructed surface left her face all at once, and what it left behind was not weakness, it was the opposite of weakness. The particular kind of courage that belongs specifically to people who have already lost everything once and choose to be present anyway without armor, without the guarantee of a different outcome this time. Her eyes filled, and she didn't manage them. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and then lowered it, and he closed the distance between them and held her both arms, the full commitment of it, and she let herself be held without reservation, her face against his shoulder, her hands gripping the front of his work shirt. The way you grip something when you have been holding on alone for a very long time and have finally been given permission to stop. The sub-basement was quiet around them. Pipes overhead running their invisible errands. The clean hum of systems maintaining the building's basic functions without anyone needing to think about it. Some repairs don't appear on any work order. They are still, in the end, the most essential kind. 3 things happened in the weeks that followed, each one a different kind of beginning that would have been impossible 4 months earlier. Nora made an appointment with a therapist found through the Employee Wellness Center bulletin board she had been walking past for months without stopping. She told Elliot about it on a Sunday at the park with the careful forward momentum of someone reporting a decision they have made and intend to honor. She said the first session was harder than she'd expected and more clarifying than she'd anticipated, which was exactly how useful things tended to arrive, wrapped in discomfort, revealing themselves gradually. Griffith came to dinner at the Penthouse for the first time in nearly 2 years. He and Elliot found common ground over the Cubs, with the ease of two men who have discovered in sports the comfortable neutral territory where honesty requires no particular bravery. Lily informed Griffith that the pattern on his tie looked like small, confused fish, a critique he received with considerably more delight than anyone expected, and the laugh it produced opened the room in a way that nothing planned could have managed. And Ava's photograph came off its hook and was rehung, not restored to the same position, but placed deliberately straight and centered above the kitchen counter in full available light, beside two of Lily's drawings and a photograph of Wren that Elliot had given Nora, which she had framed without being asked and placed without ceremony, as though it had always belonged in exactly that spot and had simply been waiting to arrive there. Elliot noticed all of this on his next visit and said nothing out loud about any of it. Some acknowledgments are better made in silence. Winter came to Chicago with its customary conviction, the lake wind carrying a cutting quality that made the air feel like something solid, something with edges, something you navigated rather than simply moved through. The city committed to its seasons fully and expected its residents to commit in return, and after enough years, most of them did. They had settled into rhythms that had stopped feeling like new arrangements and started feeling like the recovery of something that had always been there waiting under the surface for the right conditions. The park on Sundays, regardless of weather, because Lily had declared it non-negotiable, and they had both learned to trust Lily's declarations in these matters. Dinners at the Penthouse on alternate Saturdays where Nora cooked with the methodical seriousness she brought to everything, and the results were imperfect in the specific endearing ways that things are imperfect when someone is learning rather than performing. Elliot discovered he had a drawer at the Penthouse one morning in mid-November when he was looking for his watch before the commute and found it there without thinking about where else it might be. He stood in the early dark, understanding that his sense of where things belonged had reorganized itself around this place and this woman without any conscious decision having been made. He mentioned it over breakfast, and Nora looked up from her coffee with the smile that was different from her other smiles. Quieter turned inward, the expression of someone encountering a good thing they hadn't been expecting. "You've had one since October," she said. "I assumed you knew." He hadn't known. He did now. He drank his coffee and thought about how the most significant reorientations of a life rarely announced themselves. They simply arrived, and you found out about them after the fact in small moments of domestic noticing. Christmas brought its particular freight of significance, and Nora spent it with them present not as a guest navigating someone else's traditions, but as someone finding her own footing within something shared. She brought gifts that demonstrated sustained attention over time, a professional art set for Lily, calibrated to be serious without being overwhelming, and for Elliot, a vintage steel toolbox she had clearly researched, carefully solid and well-made, similar enough to his father's original that the resemblance was unmistakably deliberate. She had been paying attention for months. She had been paying attention since before either of them had named what this was. Lily gave her a card. The lettering was careful and took up most of the front. "Thank you for being my person. Not friend. Person." Lily had a precise and considered relationship with language, and the distinction between those two words was not accidental. Nora read it at the kitchen table and let the feeling move through her face without organizing it. First, the complete expression unedited the freedom of someone who has stopped treating her own emotional responses as drafts requiring revision before they can be shown to anyone. Christmas Eve late with Lily, long asleep, and the tree still lit, and the city outside carrying the specific hushed quality it reserved for nights that had given themselves permission to be still. Nora sat with her shoulder against his on the couch and her head tilted into the space between his shoulder and jaw, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was its own kind of statement. "I put Ava's picture on the wall in the light," she said eventually, her voice quiet in the way voices get quiet when they're carrying something carefully. Not as information he had already seen it, as an accounting of something interior that had shifted in the doing of it. "I want to remember her in the light. Not only in the grief, not only at midnight with a birthday cake. In the ordinary light in the regular day. She existed before I lost her." A pause. "That part of the story belongs to her, too." He pressed his mouth to her temple and held it there for a moment. She had traveled a long distance to arrive at this couch on this night in this particular quality of peace, not the performed peace of someone who has stopped letting things show, but the real kind, the kind that has been earned through the hardest possible curriculum. They both had. By different routes, at different speeds, through losses that had no parallel and grief that had no shortcut, and yet here improbably together. Spring returned to Chicago with the abrupt commitment of a city that had been waiting. The park recovered its texture and its color, the North Path becoming itself again after months of bare structural winter. Preston Hale had resigned in February, citing personal reasons, which was the institutional language for a negotiated departure under circumstances that would have been costly to contest. Garrett Cole had retained an attorney. The attorneys were conducting their business, which was not Nora's to manage, and which she had handed entirely to legal, with the focused deliberateness of someone choosing where to direct their limited energy. On a Sunday in late June, 6 months after the board meeting, 8 months after a maintenance call on the 38th floor that had sent Elliot through the wrong door, they went to the park. This had not changed, would not change. The Sundays were fixed now in the way that the best things become fixed, not by agreement or announcement, but by simple repetition, until the repetition becomes the thing itself. Nora had been quieter than usual since they'd arrived, not withdrawn, present, attentive, watching Lily conduct her ongoing diplomatic negotiations with the Duck Ponds residents. But there was something gathered in her, a quality of interior preparation, the way a person's breathing changes when they have been carrying something they are finally ready to set down somewhere specific rather than just carrying it indefinitely. Lily ran off toward the swing set with the decisive momentum of a child who has identified her next objective. The space around them opened. Nora's hand found his without her looking down to find it, the gesture belonging entirely to muscle memory now, to the body's accumulated knowledge of where things were. Her fingers settled between his with the ease of something long established. She was looking at the pond, at the way the late June light fractured across the surface into hundreds of small, moving individual points. "I've been thinking about the future," she said. Not the future as abstract concept, not the future as something to be managed or survived, but the future as something she was actively constructing an intention toward. What I actually want it to look like, not what I've been settling for calling a life. A pause that had real weight in it, the kind of pause that exists not because the speaker has run out of words, but because the next words require the full available space. I know how we got here, sideways through wrong doors and a 7-year-old who decided that a stranger deserved to know she wasn't alone. I know what it cost both of us to arrive at this. She turned and looked at him with the eyes that had once been engineered to reveal nothing, and now at least to him withheld nothing at all. I want this. All of it. Every ordinary Sunday. Every dinner where Lily provides a detailed, critical assessment of everyone's food choices. I want to stop treating happiness like a condition that might be revoked. Her voice was steady and unhurried, more decision in it than declaration, the voice of someone who has thought carefully and arrived. I want to build something that isn't waiting to be lost. The warmth that expanded in his chest at this was different from the warmth of early feeling, not that sharp, complicated brightness that arrived in the first weeks of something new, but something deeper and more anchored, the warmth of a thing that has been tested by real conditions and has held, and now knows its own strength. Are you saying what I think you're saying? A laugh came out of her, genuine, surprised at itself, the kind that arrived before she could have decided to produce it. I genuinely don't know. What do you think I'm saying? Before he could answer, Lily came sprinting back across the grass from the direction of the swing set with the particular urgency she deployed for matters of immediate natural significance, her shoes operating at the outer edge of what her coordination could reliably support, her voice arriving slightly before the rest of her. "Daddy? Nora? Right now you have to come right now, I'm not joking." They looked up. The morning had been clear when they arrived, but at some point in the last hour a brief summer system had moved through the way Chicago summer systems did, quickly, without extended announcement here, and then resolved within 20 minutes. A fast rain entirely unfelt while they were talking. Now the sky to the east above the lake had the specific pale, luminous quality that followed a fast shower and stretched across it from the tree line at the edge of the park to somewhere above the buildings along the lakeshore was a rainbow. Complete. All 7 colors present, each one distinct, the whole arc carrying the particular clarity of one that hasn't yet had time to diffuse at the edges. Lily grabbed both their hands at the same moment, one in each of hers, her grip certain and her direction purposeful. She pulled them toward the pond with the conviction of someone who has been waiting for exactly this confirmation and intends to make full use of it. "Magic bridges," she said with the specific tone of someone presenting decisive evidence to a previously skeptical audience. "Between the sad people and the happy ones. If you stand under it in the right spot, you can cross over. I told you both. I told you a long time ago." Nora and Elliot looked at each other across the top of Lily's head. Not the quick sideways glance of shared amusement, but a full look, unhurried, the kind that has enough interior space to hold everything behind it, simultaneously the wrong door and the birthday cake and the bracelet and the drawings and the letter in the toolbox and the sub-basement and the boardroom and all the Sundays, every single one of them. Everything they had carried in separate containers for years and had learned slowly and imperfectly and with considerable difficulty to carry differently. Nora's hand tightened around his. "Yes," she said, looking directly at him, the single word carrying the complete weight of everything she had left unfinished in her sentence by the pond. Yes to the question, yes to the future she had described, yes to the ordinary, irreplaceable wholeness of it. Yes to everything. They stood at the edge of the water with Lily between them, all three faces turned up toward the arc of color, already beginning its slow return to sky because rainbows never lasted, and that was never the point. The point was the standing under it while it was there. The point was the three of them, hands joined, present, in the same moment at the same time, choosing it together. If this story moved something in you, if you know what it feels like to choose to try again, after the kind of loss that makes trying feel impossible, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment and tell us what it meant to you. We read every one. That fall, at a small ceremony attended by Griffith and his family, by colleagues who had watched Elliot move through building corridors for 3 years without knowing his name, and now knew it well, by Dorothea, who took her place in the front row and did not apologize for the tears that arrived before the officiant had finished the first sentence, they made it official. The three of them together, which was always the only version that had mattered. Lily wore the purple dress. She carried a bouquet she had constructed herself from rainbow-colored flowers, each color chosen with the same seriousness she brought to all important artistic decisions, the selection process apparently having taken the better part of a Saturday afternoon. She had also prepared remarks. This information was not shared with either adult until she stepped forward before the officiant could begin and turned to face the assembled room with the composure of someone who has thought carefully about what needs to be said and is not uncertain about the saying of it. "We're not sad people who got happy," she said, in the clear, carrying voice of a 7-year-old who has decided the room needs to hear this correctly. "We're people who were sad and learned to be happy together. That's not the same thing." A pause, deliberate with real weight in it. The pause of someone who has absorbed from watching the adults around her that some sentences require the space after them to land fully. "That's better." Nobody offered a correction. She was right, and the room knew it. Standing with Nora's hand in his and Lily between them, Elliot thought about the 8 months that had moved through his life since a wrong door on the 38th floor. A birthday candle burned to almost nothing. A plastic bracelet worn for 5 years against a wrist that had learned to reach for it unconsciously the way the body reaches for the things that remind it what it has loved. A letter folded inside a toolbox that had waited 4 years for him to be ready to open it, written by a woman who had understood him well enough to know exactly what he would need and patient enough to leave it somewhere he would eventually find. He thought about Wren, who had expressed love as preparation, as the careful, practical work of ensuring that the people she loved would have what they needed after she was gone. He thought about Ava, who had spent 4 years developing a theory about magic bridges and sad people and happy people and the colored arcs of light that connected them, a theory she had apparently been correct about in ways she never got to see confirmed. He thought about what it had required of Nora to let someone through the door she had spent 5 years reinforcing not once but again and again, each time the exposure increased, each time the cost of being wrong got higher. The specific bravery of someone who has learned exactly how catastrophic loss can be and steps back into range of it anyway, not because the fear is gone, but because the wanting has finally grown larger than the fear. The road ahead would carry its difficult passages. Grief did not conclude cleanly. It surfaced on random Tuesdays, triggered by songs in grocery stores or the particular angle of October light or small shoes seen on a shelf. There would be mornings when the past arrived with more weight than the future, when old losses presented themselves without warning and required sitting with without resolution, without the comfort of any narrative that made it make sense. That was the true version. That was the actual texture of it. But they would sit with it together, which changed the weight in ways that didn't reduce to simple arithmetic. Not halved grief, never divided that cleanly but distributed differently across more than one set of shoulders held by more than one pair of hands. The difference between a weight carried alone in a penthouse kitchen at midnight year after year, with only silence for company, and the same weight carried alongside someone who had seen the full truth of it and chosen to stay. The people you lose do not leave the story. They become structural, present in how you love the next person, in the specific patience you bring to ordinary Sundays, because you know now from experience that ordinary Sundays are not guaranteed. Wren lived in the way Lily drew rainbows with edges that blurred into each other because her father had taught her that imperfection could be beautiful, and he had learned that from watching Wren move through the world. Ava lived in every drawing on every refrigerator in the way Nora now stood at the edge of duck ponds on Sunday mornings and looked up at the sky without flinching when it offered something worth seeing. What they had built was not constructed despite the loss. It was made from the same material, the grief and the endurance and the long years of learning to breathe around something immovable. What they had was exactly what Lily had said with the precision she brought to everything that mattered, not sadness, converted into happiness by some process of subtraction, but the discovery that both could be held at once in the same hands without one negating the other. Joy and sorrow as adjacent rooms in the same house, each one real, each one livable, the door between them standing open. That was the life that had been waiting on the other side of the wrong door. That was what became possible when two people who had been broken by loss stopped waiting for the break to be fully mended before they tried again and found in the trying that the trying was exactly how the mending arrived. Not perfect, not healed in the way that word implied a clean and final resolution, but together, which turned out to be the only version of whole that had ever actually been on offer, and which turned out against all reasonable expectation after everything to be more than enough. If this story reminded you that healing is possible even after the kind of loss that feels unsurvivable, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Heart Echo Stories for more. We'll see you in the next one.